My name's Tina Hargaden, and I go all over the place and talk to teachers in a lot of different contexts, and the question of assessment comes up all the time. And I just wanted to give an overview of some problems that people have with assessment and a quick overview of the actual performance and proficiency levels before we start talking about the nuts and bolts of assessment. So there's a few problems that tend to come up with assessment. One is what to assess. Many of us were taught in a way in which we were assessed on, like when we first learned a language, in a way that we were assessed on our accuracy and our command of certain verb forms and our knowledge of vocabulary lists. And our assessments were based on our being able to recognize those words or use those words or put together some type of grammar paradigm correctly. So, of course, we do want our students to eventually be able to output correct grammar. However, if we're teaching for language acquisition, assessing them on outputting grammar, especially at the beginning of their language career, and by beginning, I mean the first year and 2 years, and even into the third year, it takes them a really long time to acquire the ability to output correctly and use proper grammar. So if we're assessing them on grammar and we're trying to teach for language acquisition and language proficiency, then those two goals are actually at odds with each other. And in the supplement that I'm submitting with this session, I wrote a lot about sort of some other problems that come when we start basing our assessments and our grades on students' ability to correctly output verb paradigms or adjective agreement or vocabulary words. One big effect is that it sends the kids the message that I am not very good at learning Spanish. I can't remember these words and I can't manipulate these grammar paradigms correctly. Now, it is true that students do have differing abilities to manipulate those grammar paradigms, but it's not true that students have differing abilities to acquire proficiency in the language. If you wonder if it's true that students can all acquire a proficiency in your language, you should just look at them speaking in their first language and realize that what they did to acquire their first language is what they can do, given the right conditions, to acquire their second language or their third language or whichever language you happen to be teaching them. So, in my opinion, if we're assessing students on their ability to manipulate verb forms or their ability to memorize consciously a list of vocabulary words by a certain date, then we're sending them the message that some of us are programmed to learn languages and some of us are not. But that's just absolutely not true because they can all speak their first language. So they've already proven that they can do it once or maybe even twice. Some of my students speak 3 and 4 languages. So they've proven that they can do it once or twice or more than that. Why are we making them study the language in different parts and manipulate them when that's not actually what leads to language proficiency? So a lot of teachers, when they move away from that grammar kind of presentation and practice where you present the model, you practice the rule, when they move away from that grammar-heavy traditional type of teaching, and they go into a more proficiency-based teaching style, many teachers wonder, well, what do I assess now? I've been assessing them on manipulating these grammar paradigms and memorizing these words. So what now? So if we look at the ACTFL standards and the can-do statements are all arranged in students, they're arranged to assess students' ability to express themselves in the language and interpret messages in the language. So they should be able to express themselves in speaking and writing and interpret the language through listening and reading it. So the ACTFL standards ask us to assess them on their ability to use the language. And once again, that's in listening and reading and speaking and writing. So what we need to do is set up assessments that give students the opportunity to use the language. And then we can see what level they are performing when they're asked to speak on a certain topic or listen to a certain audio recording or listen to their teacher talking. So in a proficiency-oriented classroom, what we're really assessing is their ability to communicate in the language, either by listening, by interpreting, listening and reading, or expressing themselves through writing and speaking. Another question that comes up is, what about like their accuracy? So when should I expect that I'm gonna stop seeing these patterns of really annoying errors? In Spanish, you've probably seen students write things like tiene, because they know that O means I, and they hear tiene and tienes a lot more than tengo. So they have a tendency to put the O on tieno and make this really annoying and incorrect, grammatical construction. However, the issue with proficiency-based instruction is that these patterns are only going to go away with repeated exposure to the correct patterns in the language. If we want students to be able to communicate in an unrehearsed and spontaneous way, just like I'm talking to the camera right now in English, my native language, if we want them to just be able to express themselves without having to think about the rules of the language, then we are going to just have to get comfortable with the fact that for a while they are going to be outputting language that they're kind of making up inside their heads. Because that's exactly what they're doing. They're taking in all this data that we're giving them through messages that they're listening to and reading, and inside of their head, they're building their own acquired system of competence in the language. And so when they output things like this, to them, according to what their system is telling them to output, it is actually correct and it aligns with what they've built inside their heads. The only way to sort of flush out those error patterns is for them to hear more input and revise the system that's inside their head so that later on they'll be able to output correctly. Now, of course, we can teach them the grammar point. We can say it's, tango. And we can get them to practice that, and we can teach them why, and we can talk to them about stem changing verbs, and they can, many of them, not all of them, some kids really struggle with, you probably know this if you've been teaching longer than 5 minutes, okay? Many students struggle even with tons of explanations and different ways of explaining the grammar. Many students still kind of have a hard time putting it together in their head and making sense of it just cognitively, much less outputting it spontaneously and correctly. So the answer is to keep on giving them more and more input so that they're revising that system in their heads. And then eventually they'll output the correct form after they've heard it many, many times. Now, you can try to shortcut that by consciously teaching them to their conscious mind. It's tango, and practice that and do a lot of exercises with it. And then for a while, if they have time to think about the rule and the rule's fresh on their minds and they know that they're being graded on it, you can get them to output the correct form. However, true proficiency means that even when they're not being freshly taught the rule and when they're just expressing themselves without thinking too much and in a spontaneous situation where they don't have much time to revise what they're saying, they will act as if we've never taught them that and revert back to the pattern that's consistent with what they've built inside their heads. So when can we expect these patterns of errors to stop? I would say after we've given them lots and lots and lots of exposure to the language. So, we're only assessing them on how they use the language, and we're not really expecting until very late on that they're going to be able to flush out in spontaneous speech and writing these patterns of errors. So what can we do? How do we know that our students are making progress? how can we assess them in a way that's consistent with what actually happens in our brains when we're acquiring another language, and gives them the confidence to keep on going and interacting with the language and seeing themselves as a capable language learner? Well, in order for us to answer that question, or for me to answer that question, sort of my job here, I'm the one in front of the camera. In order for me to answer that question, I want to give you a very quick overview of the ACTFL proficiency and performance guidelines. In the materials that I'm going to be submitting for the conference, you will get a comic book version that I drew of these ACTFL guidelines and sort of my explanation of them, but I just want to give you a quick overview right now. So we can think of the ACTFL guidelines as sort of a ladder that goes from novice to intermediate to advanced. Now, the ACTFL guidelines don't stop with advanced. They actually go on to superior and distinguished. And I think a lot of teachers, when they hear the word advanced, they think that that's like native-like proficiency and that students are going to be like, you know, little mini adults in the language, and that's actually not true. Even in advanced, students are still going to make errors. Then intermediate, if we think about how advanced isn't like the final destination that we want our students to get to, that means if we back up to intermediate, we're going to see a lot more errors. This is a very messy stage of language acquisition. And then we get down to the novice level. At the novice level, this is when students are just barely starting out with the language. Most students in a proficiency-based classroom where they're hearing a lot of the language will progress very quickly through novice and then kind of get stuck in intermediate and hang out there for a long time. So most of what we're working with in our middle and high school classrooms and even elementary school classrooms where they're hearing a lot of language and they're getting a big dose of it, not just maybe once a week, most of what we're seeing in our students is at this intermediate level. So at the novice level, students are gonna, this is at the beginning, right? First year, first semester. That would be first year, first semester in a proficiency-based classroom where they're interacting with a lot of language. Students in a traditional classroom can stay at novice for quite some time. And you'll see why in just a minute. So at the novice level, students first start outputting like at the word level. So they're only able to say isolated words and maybe list things. Like a task they could do would be make a shopping list for your party, all the things you need to buy. Then they start moving up to the phrase level. So they're able to start using mostly memorized phrases, you know, greetings, courtesy phrases, things like that. Up at the top of novice and on into intermediate low, we start to see students outputting at the sentence level. So what separates a novice student's sentences from an intermediate student's sentences? I was very curious about this, and so recently I arranged for us to have an ACTFL training from an ACTFL writing trainer, actually right here in this room, here in Portland. And what he said separates the novice level sentence from the intermediate level sentence is a very important distinction. So the novice level sentence, because the sentence level of discourse does span these two proficiency bands or performance bands, a novice level sentence is memorized. So even though they're outputting at like a sentence level, it's something that they've heard as that sentence and they're just giving it back as like a unit. The thing that would make a sentence level discourse be an intermediate low would be that it's recombined. So it's recombined elements of the language that they have learned, but now they're starting to put them together in different ways to express their own meaning. So it's at this intermediate level that they start being able to express their own thoughts and their own meaning. So now you can see, I think, why students in traditional classrooms where they're doing a lot of memorizing and like doing dialogues together and memorizing vocabulary lists and memorizing grammar paradigms, how that would help them to kind of stay stuck in this novice level for longer. You might not believe this, but it's true. When I teach first year 7th grade students or first year high school students, they move from novice to intermediate I give my first assessments after 5 weeks of instruction, and they're already able to output at least the sentence level, if not the higher levels. And they're expressing their own meaning. And the reason is because whatever we put into the students is what is eventually going to come out. And if we put in memorized sentences and memorized phrases and lists of words, that's all they're going to have to output when it comes time for them to speak or write. If we give them input at this intermediate level, which would be sentences that express things that we're talking about in class, or even strings of sentences and paragraphs, then that's what they're going to output when it comes time to do so. However, if they don't get it put in, it's very difficult to see it come out of them in the form of output. Excuse me, I'm getting thirsty. So that brings me to, what does discourse look like at the intermediate level? So in the intermediate level, they start at this sentence level, but they're already starting to recombine the language into new patterns to make their own meaning. And then they move on to like strings of sentences. That would be strings of sentences that are different from each other, not just like, I like potato chips, I like popcorn, I like peanut butter, I like baseball. That's more of this memorized sentence level discourse. So it's strings of sentences that actually like carry some meaning together as a unit and are different from each other. And then up towards the top, once again, we have this discourse structure. You notice like the structure of the discourse is getting more and more, it's getting longer basically as we go on, and more creative and more expressive as we go on. So at the top of intermediate high, moving into advanced low, we start seeing students outputting in what we would consider like a paragraph. So what is it that makes a paragraph an intermediate high level of performance versus an advanced low level of performance? It would be the organization. So when they're able to perform at an advanced level, they have a more organized paragraph structure. It's like a topic sentence, 3 reasons why, and a conclusion. And if you've ever taken a standardized test in a language, that is something that they do look for. I remember when I was learning Spanish or acquiring Spanish and taking my test to become a teacher in the state of Oregon, I had to memorize basically like how to organize a paragraph because they're looking for that to see if we have a high enough level of proficiency. So the paragraphs in intermediate are not as organized as the paragraphs at advanced. An advanced student controls more linking structures and has a wider range of vocabulary to where they can make their paragraphs more organized. By the end of advanced, students should be able to output discourse that we would probably call more like an essay, either spoken or written. So that would be several paragraphs that go together and lead the listener or the reader through some type of a thought path. They put out a main idea and then they give some subtopics. Or they say an argument, a claim, an opinion, and then they give reasons why and say why those reasons are valid, and maybe even quote or cite some other sources like an article or a video that they watched. I do want you to know that I've taught language arts for a long time at the middle school and high school level, and many of our students, even in their first languages, are not really able to output at that level of organization, even in their native language. So to get students to be able to do this in our world language classrooms is quite a feat, but it truly can be done with the proper scaffolding It could be done in every subject matter with the proper scaffolding, but a lot of times teachers don't know how to provide that scaffolding. So, this shows you that we go from very small pieces of discourse up to longer and more academic pieces of discourse. Something else that you should understand about the ACTFL levels before we move on is the topic and ideas that they're able to address, both in interpreting meaning and expressing meaning, they change as we go up the levels. A novice student, the type of topic that they're able to interact with and express and understand meaning in regards to would be very concrete and personal topics. That would be things like saying where you're from, or introducing yourself, or saying what your school is named, or maybe naming some teachers. In intermediate, they're still talking about topics of personal interest. So like sports they enjoy, or stories about their life, or just daily things that happen to them. But they're able to start talking about things that are a little bit more abstract. And one major thing that ACTFL wants to see in intermediate students is that they're able to talk about the different time frames. So they're able to talk about things that happened in the past, things that will happen in the future, and things that are happening now. ACTFL doesn't specify that they're supposed to be able to use the preterite and the imperfect. They don't go that far as to say that they need to use certain verb forms, but they do say that they need to be able to narrate and describe with increasing accuracy as they go on in various time frames. When we get up to advanced, you might guess by the essay being the discourse type, students are expected in advanced to be able to talk about topics of world interest and community interest, as well as topics that they've studied in school or on the job. So that would be like being able to describe the solar system and its different components, like the inner planets, the outer planets, the dwarf planets, and the rotation of all the planets around the sun. Or it would be able to talk about why recycling is important, or to say why democracy is their preferred form of government. So this requires them to have a much broader range of vocabulary. And in fact, at the advanced level, they are expected to be able to use some vocabulary from these specific domains. Also, I was touching on this earlier with these patterns of errors. The final thing that ACTFL talks about as we move up this ladder of performance or proficiency is a student's ability to make themselves understood to a person who's not accustomed to dealing with student output. I personally think they could have said making oneself understood to a not teacher person. Because we're very accustomed to dealing with student output, and we can often, knowing their first language and knowing the interference that happens between English and Spanish or Chinese and Spanish, we're able to kind of ferret out the meaning that they were trying to express. However, the ultimate goal is for them to be able to talk to other people that aren't teachers out there in the world who speak the languages. And so making oneself understood comprehensively without a bunch of misunderstandings due to inaccuracies in their language use, that is the ultimate goal. However, it's not until we get to the advanced level that they are expected to be able to consistently do that. So at the advanced level, they're supposed to be able to interact with native speakers, who are not used to listening to and reading student output. So that would be it's not so annoying and it's not so full of errors that cause a breakdown in comprehension. They're also supposed to be able to control most basic structures of the language. However, when students try to use more idiomatic expressions or higher levels of structure that maybe they haven't had a lot of exposure to, then they could still be breaking down in their ability to make themselves understood. At the intermediate level, it's very interesting because it says major at the beginning of intermediate. We'll see major patterns of errors. That's like this. Tieno is an error pattern. They obviously know that the O designates that it's I who's doing the speaking, but they don't know the stem and how to work with that. So this is a pattern of errors. This would be a very typical type of output that you would see at the beginning of the intermediate level. And as they move up through the intermediate level, we should see more and more control of those basic structures so that it wouldn't be difficult for them to make themselves understood to this native speaker who doesn't usually deal with students. At the novice level, we don't even see patterns of errors. And I think the reason is twofold. One, it's just sort of a big mess because they just got started and they really will break down super quickly when asked to express anything. I mean, think about it. If all they're using is memorized phrases, if they're asked to recombine some language into something to express a new idea, they're going to completely break down. They just don't have that ability yet. So one, it's a major mess. And two, when they are outputting phrases and sentences, it's memorized things. So they probably most likely memorized it in its proper form as a unit of language. If they didn't memorize it in its proper form as a unit of language, it's probably because their teacher or their textbook or whatever resource they're using to learn didn't give it to them in its proper form. And I'd say that's probably on us. So, if we think about the fact that we're trying to assess them on if you are moving towards a more proficiency-oriented, communicative language teaching style, if you're assessing them on these things, then how can we assess like a brand new beginner or an intermediate in a way that makes them feel confident and shows them that they're actually slowly but surely building this language system in their heads? There's a lot more information on this in the resource that I'm uploading to the conference, but I'm going to go over very briefly some examples of how I assess, and I'm going to actually do that by giving you a short lesson in French. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit of instruction and then the assessment that I would do based on that instruction. If you read the document that I uploaded to the conference, you'll see that the way I organize my year and the way many people that I work with have also organized their years is to have 5 weeks of instruction, and during that period of instruction we do certain activities, and those are planned out to engage students in different types of language and different types of discourse, but I'm not really focusing so much on the exact words that are being used. I am trying to limit myself to words that they are familiar with and not introduce too many new vocabulary words in a given lesson, but I'm not really focusing on that word level because if you think about the ACTFL standards, the word level is a very low level. So I'm trying to give them discourse that is in longer sentence and paragraph levels. So I'm going to show you a strategy that I use frequently, almost every single day actually, of discussing the calendar with my students. Then I'll show you very briefly another strategy that I use pretty much every day. And I don't discuss the calendar like the whole period every day, but at the beginning of the year we discuss it a little bit longer because it's interesting to them. And then after that we just taper off and we just do a little bit of calendar and weather report at the beginning of the day. Unless something really crazy and cool is happening, like maybe snow is in the forecast for Portland, we don't spend that much time on the calendar. But I'll show you sort of a beginning of the first year strategy of using the calendar, and then I'll show you write and discuss, which is a way that I generally end almost every single class period. And basically what Write and Discuss does is it takes all the oral language that you produce during that class period and solidifies it in a conversational style with the students, like you're talking to them, and you're also solidifying it by writing it. So that's why it's called Write and Discuss. If you want to see more of this type of strategy, there's lots of teachers who've been posting these strategies on YouTube. You can go and search those up. If you just search by the name of the strategy, either like calendar talk or Write and Discuss, then you can see many, many examples of this. But I'm just going to do a very basic lesson on the calendar, just for the purposes of generating some content and some language that I can then use in our summative portfolio assessments. I don't have time in this video to talk about our daily assessments and formative assessments, but I did load in a newsletter in which you can learn and see all the rubrics for those types of assessments. So, I'm going to start talking in French now, and you're going to have a real short lesson on the calendar. Okay, and it's kind of strange because I'm in a room by myself, but that's the nature of a video conference. Okay, class. Regardez. Now, regarder means look. So show me that. Regardez. Okay, class. Regard. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I didn't say this, but usually before I start any activity, I tell the students in English, their first language for mine, I tell them in their first language what we're going to do. So I would say this to the kids. You guys, we're going to discuss the calendar now. So I'm going to talk in French about the calendar, and it's your job to listen and understand what I'm saying. Okay, class, regardez. Oh, now, regarder means look. So show me that, please. Regardez. And I'll be making them do the gesture with me. Okay, regardez le calendrier. C-A-L-E-N-D-R-I-E-R. Regardez, classe, le calendrier. Okay. Le calendrier. Regardez, s'il vous plaît. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ça, c'est la semaine scolaire. Lundi, mardi, mercredi, jeudi et vendredi. 5 jours. La semaine scolaire. Hey classe. Semaine scolaire en anglais. School week. Oui. Ok, ça. Lundi, mardi, mercredi, jeudi et vendredi. C'est la semaine scolaire. Et ça, c'est le week-end. Hey class. Penser. Oh, penser means think. So show me penser. Regarder. Penser. Classe. Penser à la semaine scolaire. Et penser au week-end. Qui préfère means prefers. So show me that. Préfère, regarde, pense, préfère. Hey classe. Qui préfère la semaine scolaire? Qui préfère la semaine scolaire? Oh, classe. Personne ne préfère la semaine scolaire. Ok. Et classe, qui préfère le week-end? Oh, classe! 100% de la classe préfère le week-end. Et classe, 0% de la classe préfère la semaine scolaire. Le week-end est populaire. Now, if you teach Spanish, or French, you're lucky because you have all these cognates you can draw on. So populaire is very easy for the kids to understand in this context. Et classe, la semaine scolaire est populaire ou pas populaire? Oui, la semaine scolaire n'est pas populaire. So we could go on and on with that, but I'm going to move on to this strategy of write and discuss. Now, generally when I'm doing this in my class, I'm doing it facing the kids on a document camera, but I'm just going to do it up here so you can see it better. Okay. Le week-end. Hey classe, 100% ou 0% de la classe préfère le week-end? Oui, 100% de la classe préfère classe. 100% de la classe préfère le week-end ou la semaine scolaire? Oui, le week-end. Le week-end est populaire ou pas populaire? Oui, populaire. Et classe, le week-end est populaire ou super populaire? Oui, classe, le week-end est super populaire. Point d'exclamation. So probably in class I would go on to do a couple more sentences, but I'm going to cut that off right now so we can skip ahead 5 weeks. If this was the first day of school, after 5 weeks I would be giving them their summative portfolio assessments. And I'm going to do them really quickly with you in listening, reading, writing, and speaking. If you want more information, I'm going to put links to example videos from my actual classroom. I took a lot of videos when I taught middle school Spanish and French. I'll put links to those, to one example of each assessment style in the resources that I'm going to upload. Generally, I actually give these directions in French with a lot of visual scaffolding, but I'm not going to do that for you right now. You can see that on the videos. So during our portfolio assessment week, basically we're spending 1 day on each skill. So the first day I do listening, then reading, then writing, and then speaking, or writing and speaking. Sometimes I mix them up a little bit, do one first and the other second. So I'm going to show you an example of one part of a listening assessment. For first year kids, when I'm giving them a listening assessment, usually what we're talking about is kind of short little bursts. And so I'll pull out like 4 or 5, maybe 6 artifacts that we've created as a class during the previous 5 weeks. And I'll spend about 3 or 4 minutes talking about each one and then taking the students through the assessment cycle. But I'm only going to do one part right now because you don't have time to watch all of them. Okay, class, partie 1. Part 1. Oh, and their pencils are down. Okay, class, regardez, écoutez, regardez-moi, écoutez-moi. Okay? Le calendrier contient 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 jours. La semaine scolaire contient 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 jours. Et le week-end en contient 2. La semaine scolaire n'est pas populaire. Et le week-end est populaire. Très populaire. Super populaire. Ultra populaire. 100% de la classe préfère le week-end. Excuse me. Et personne ne préfère la semaine scolaire. So then I would step away from that, and in some classes I'll take it down. But if my students are very fearful or need, if they're like very low literacy, some student populations have a very low amount of literacy and they really need to be built up a lot. And so it kind of depends on my student population if I'm going to keep that up for them to refer to. Because basically what I want from this assessment is for them to feel very powerful with the language. They should be. They're performing at a very high level for a 5 weeks into the school year class. So then I would have them pick up their pencils and I would just re-narrate the same thing to them, but with pauses so they can keep up and write. So they're writing in English what they understand. And the reason that I'm having them write in English is to isolate that skill of listening. If I had them write in French, A, I don't know if they're just writing down what they think they understand and just like replicating what I'm saying, and B, if their writing is really bad, I don't know if it's because their writing skill is poor or if their listening skill is poor. So I have them write in English so that I can tell what they actually understood from the French that they're hearing. Okay, classe, écoutez et écrivez. En français, classe, ou en anglais? Oui, en anglais. In English. Okay, classe. Le calendrier contient 7 jours. Et la semaine scolaire contient 5 jours. They're writing, I'm just waiting for them. Le week-end contient 2 jours. Et la semaine scolaire en contient 5. Usually it takes a little longer in class. This is very relaxing for the teacher. And usually pretty relaxing for the kids too, because it's very easy for them, it's very achievable. So I go through the whole kind of re-narrating, trying to remember everything that I said. I don't usually talk from a script because I feel like kind of varying what I'm saying is a more authentic listening experience for them instead of hearing the exact thing over and over. So then once I've gone through the whole section and sort of retold to them all the things that I talked about originally using the visual aid, then I'll just go back through and let them sort of revise or add anything that they missed. But I go a little quicker, so it sounds something like this. Okay, class, Le calendrier contient 7 jours et la semaine scolaire en contient 5. Lundi, mardi, mercredi, jeudi et vendredi. Et le week-end contient 2 jours, samedi et dimanche. Le week-end est super populaire. Mais la semaine scolaire ne l'est pas. Personne ne préfère la semaine scolaire. Mais le week-end est super populaire. 100% de la classe préfère le week-end. Et personne ne préfère, 0% de la classe préfère la semaine scolaire. And then we would just move on to something else. Basically, I want this listening assessment to take the entire period, so I will continue to just pull things off the walls and keep talking to them until the bell rings at the end. This assessment week is actually, some people call it spa week because it's a very relaxing experience for the teacher, and I certainly want to stretch out the listening for the entire period. So then for the reading, what I would do is take what we've done in class. Now, I usually write by hand in class. I didn't have time to show you like all the reading options. If you want to go to my YouTube channel, it's called CI Liftoff. Like a rocket ship lifting off. There's me inside. If you go to CI Liftoff and search for reading options, you'll find a ton of reading options that I do with this. But what I'll usually do for the assessment is take a few things that we've talked about in class, or in an upper level class, maybe we told a story, or maybe it was a longer piece of writing. I'll take it home or during my prep period and I'll type it up. And so each class gets their own at first, because I really want them to have their own language in front of them so that they can perform at their highest level. So each student would have this on their desk in a typed up form. And if all I had was very short pieces that we wrote in a first year class, for instance, I'll just have like 4 or 5 different topics arranged into paragraphs, like different sections. And they won't really go together like a long reading, but it'll still give them some connected discourse to interact with. So this is like intermediate level discourse. It's about a personal topic and it's connected sentences that all go together, and they're all unique sentences, not just a list of the same text type. I like this, I like that, I like this, I like that. So I can give them this intermediate listening performance assessment and ask them to translate it into English. Once again, I'm isolating that skill of reading. So I'm only asking them to read in French and express their understandings in their strongest language. So I'll hand it out to the students, and then I'll have my own copy, and I'll walk around the room as I'm reading it out loud to them, making sure that my students are actually following along on their papers. I do that because when we read and hear the words read out loud to us, we actually comprehend better. So in order to scaffold their comprehension, I'll read it out loud to them, and then I'll have them work on their own and write down what they understood in English. Most students translate every single word. That's why on the retail rubric, I actually added underneath the first line on the retail rubric, I added on some other options that you can add as the year goes on, which is asking them to make inferences and think about the character and the setting and how they organize their retail. That's to get them out of just translating every single word, because most of them will do that. This language is very familiar to them by this point. So I'll read it out loud to them. And when I'm reading, I'm not trying to make it a gotcha experience. You'll notice that when I was talking about the calendar, I was still using gestures, I was still pointing to things, and even when I was retelling it without the visual aid, I was still using those body language gestures and intonation to help them understand the meaning. Language doesn't happen in isolation. The purpose of language is so we can communicate meaning. And so when we're using language, even right now when I'm speaking to you, I'm using body language, intonation, facial expressions to get my meaning across to you the best way that I know how. So even in an assessment situation, I still feel like we should be scaffolding our students with those natural human tendencies, because that's what language is. It's a human trait. It's probably the defining human trait, actually. So I feel like we shouldn't remove all that and just speak to them like a robot. We should still be talking to them in a scaffolded, contextualized, real, authentic, natural way. So I'll read it out loud to them with expression. I don't talk in English, I just read it in French, but I do know that research shows that hearing the words read with expression and seeing them on the page does scaffold comprehension. So I would just read it to them, just straight through. Le week-end. 100% de la classe préfère le week-end. Le week-end est super populaire. Now, of course, in a regular setting, this would be a lot longer. So generally, with the listening assessment, I do it in little chunks. And with the reading assessment, it might be sort of chunks because there's different paragraphs and different topics, especially in a novice level class. But I just read the whole thing like all the way through and then have them sit and work. It's kind of like heaven on earth, actually, because then I just get to watch my little darlings push those pencils across the paper. It's quite nice. So then they sit down and express their understandings of this text in English. For speaking, the speaking rubric is in, the speaking rubric is in the resources that I loaded into the, or I hope that Jared will load into the conference, but I just want to very quickly show you what that looks like. So basically there's me, their loving teacher, and I might prepare a list of questions, or I might not. And then I put the students in partnerships. So every student is in a partnership. This kid is not quite sure if they like what's going on. And this is basically the question and answer game made into an assessment. In fact, we play the question and answer game a lot in class, but it originally started as me trying to get my students to help me pilot this assessment, and I was just calling it a game. So the rubric for the speaking assessment is basically the game board for the question and answer game, except for instead of like points on the top, it has like novice low, novice mid, novice high, and it's got the same indicators. Like I said something in English to show that I understood. I said a word, I said a phrase, I said a sentence. So we've practiced this a lot in class by playing the question and answer game, so it's a familiar format to the students. There's no erasers in here. One sec. So basically the way it works is, I'm not going to erase that. I'll ask question 1 so we got partners, partner A and partner B. For the game, I let them choose their own partners, but for an assessment, I partner them up intentionally with kids they're not friends with, just to minimize the chance that they're going to cheat for their partner. And I also circulate around, just so I can kind of keep an eye on them, and then they think that I know if they're cheating. I don't really know if they're cheating. It's impossible to know. But at least being in proximity to them makes them feel a little more accountable to the virtue of honesty. So I'll ask a question, like I'll say partner A, question 1. So partner A answers the question and partner B listens and circles what partner A did on question number 1. So maybe they said novice high, they said one sentence. So then I'll say partner B, question 1. So then partner A is going to listen and partner B is going to talk and answer my question to partner A. And then partner A on partner B's grade sheet is going to circle maybe partner B only said a phrase, so they get novice high. And then that goes in their portfolio too, along with their listening and their reading assessments. For their writing assessments, I generally tell them to just write for 10 minutes or 20 minutes depending on their stamina. Some classes can go for 20 during an assessment situation, and some only have the focus and stamina for 10. So I'll have them write for 10 minutes, and usually I say, like, they don't have a dictionary, they don't have a textbook, they don't have a list of words or anything like that. I just say, use what's inside your head and make up a story or describe something. Sometimes I'll give them a prompt, but most of the time I just let them do a free write. Some teachers have them retell something that, like a story they've done in class, or here's the calendar, look at it and write about it. Some teachers do that, but I feel like it's a lot more indicative of what they can actually do if I just say sit down and write. Because think about it, if somebody told you to sit down and write in English or in Spanish, or somebody told me to do the same in the languages that I can write in, I would just sit down and make something up and write it, and I would be able to show what I know that way. So I feel like it's a little more authentic or a little more proficiency oriented to just let them write about whatever. Then on Friday, sometimes we'll just play games and sort of have a celebration and just kind of take it easy. And sometimes I'll do a challenge day where I bring in a little more challenging texts for them to work with, and we'll just very quickly dip into all those texts. So maybe I'll tell them a new story that they've never heard before and see how they do with their listening. And maybe I'll give them a text that I wrote for them that shows how they can do with reading something unfamiliar. In higher level classes, I like to show them native speakers, videos, so they can interact with somebody brand new. I like to bring in texts that I found on the internet. Sometimes I modify them, for a second or third year class. I'll often take the text level kind of down and throw out some of the sentences and kind of rearrange them so they're simpler to read. But on that challenge day, it's great to give them a chance to interact with an unknown topic or some speaker that they've never interacted with before. Then by the time we get up to the higher levels of proficiency, if they've had a really good, strong basis of proficiency in the first 2 or 3 years, by the 3rd and 4th year, they're able to not do their assessments based on classroom created things. They're able to just do more of a totally unknown task. Hey you guys, I'm gonna show you this video that was made for 2nd graders in Quebec about Canada Day or whatever topic that it is. So completely unknown topic, and see what they can extract. I always do warn my students that when we do a challenge or an unknown type of speaker or text or topic, that they'll probably notice they don't get as much as they do when we do a more performance assessment that we've practiced in class. So I hope this has helped you to get your mind around what you could assess in a proficiency-oriented language class. Basically, our goal is to have the students using the language, and so our assessments should reflect that goal and see how they can actually perform when they're using the language, to listen, to read, to write, and to speak. There's a lot more resources that I'm going to put in the little newsletter that I'm putting together for you guys, and I'll include some links to some videos. And please do follow up with me. I'm going to put a link where you can register for my newsletter. I send out a newsletter every week to the list of people that have signed up. And so if you sign up, I would love to keep in touch and hear from you later. Thanks for joining me, and happy assessing.